In this video, we will configure high availability between two FortiGate units. So this is a dedicated diagram that I put together that shows how our two firewalls are connected together to provide redundancy. So the firewall on the left is what we have been configuring for the entire video series. And we will call this firewall number 1. And we want that to be the primary firewall in this cluster. Now the firewall on the right is a brand new firewall that has not been configured, and we will call this firewall number 2. We want this firewall to be the secondary or standby firewall in this cluster, taking over if a failover or if a failure occurs on the primary firewall. Also in this diagram, you will see that each of these firewalls will have a WAN connection and a LAN connection, which is important. And furthermore, we will have a dedicated connection between these two firewalls, which is right here, which is responsible for two main operations. So one, it is responsible for sending a heartbeat message between the two firewalls to ensure that they are alive and active. And its second purpose is that it is used for synchronizing configuration, changes, and firewall sessions to the secondary firewall in the cluster. And we will use the DMZ interface as our heartbeat interface between these two firewalls. The last thing that is important is that in order to set up high availability between two firewalls, they must be the exact same firewall model, running the same OS version, and has the same security subscriptions enabled. But this is the diagram that we will reference when we set up HA in this video. And right now in our environment, we have our second firewall connected along with the heartbeat connection, ready for us to start configuring high availability. There are two HA modes that you can configure on FortiGate. There is active passive, which is the most common, and in that mode, only one firewall is active while the other firewall is in standby mode. The other HA mode is active-active, where both firewalls are active, load balancing traffic between them. So we'll be setting up both methods and confirm that it works. But first, we'll be setting up active-passive HA between our two firewalls. So from the dashboard on our primary firewall, that's firewall number 1, the HA status up here shows standalone, which means that our firewall is not enabled for HA. To change that, you will click on Configure next to it. Okay, and this will show what can be configured to provide high availability. Here under Mode, you will see the available HA options that we can choose, and in our case, we will select Active Passive. Again, this firewall will be our primary firewall or the master firewall in the HA cluster. To make this firewall the master, we need to set the device priority to be a higher value compared to what the other firewall will be using. And the default is 128, so let's change the priority to be 150. Okay, next under cluster settings, we will enter a group name which must match on the other firewall. We'll say Route Hub, along with the correct password. So we'll just make up a password here. Oops, let's try this again. Okay. Now we will also enable session pickup, which will synchronize all the active sessions to the other firewall to allow faster recovery if the primary firewall should fail. And below that, we'll show all of the interfaces on our firewall based on the model that is used. So based on our diagram, we want the heartbeat interface to be our DMZ interface, which is not in use or enabled yet. So the other firewall will also use the DMZ as its heartbeat interface, which will be used for the two firewalls to communicate together and to ensure that they are active and running without any issues. So this would be the heartbeat messages confirming if the other firewall is alive. So let's go ahead and turn off the heartbeat interface for the WAN interface, which is one of our production interfaces that we want to monitor. And the main interfaces that are important is the LAN interface and the WAN interface based on our design to allow proper communication. So it's important that we monitor those interfaces. So if one of them is detected as down, then it will trigger a HA failover to the other firewall. Now, since our firewall model has an internal switch where the switch ports are all part of the internal interface, we are not able to monitor that interface, which is why there is no option to actually enable port monitoring. It has to be an individual or a dedicated port on the firewall to allow that or to enable that, like our WAN port. So let's enable our WAN interface for port monitor. Okay, and that is all we need to do. So we're done. Let's go ahead and apply our changes. And of course, now that has been configured, and so far there's only one firewall in this HA cluster. And after a while, you see this being updated, reflecting our firewall, now acting as a master with the priority that we have established. So now let's go to our secondary firewall that we're connected to here on the second tab. And again, this is a new firewall that has not been configured. So once it is part of the HA cluster, then the configuration from the primary firewall will be synchronized to this firewall automatically. So let's enable HA on this firewall. And to do that, we'll go to configure next to standalone. And then here we will set the HA mode to once again be active passive. We will leave the device priority as 128, which will be lower compared to the other firewall, making this our standby or slave firewall in the cluster. And under cluster settings, let's enter the same group name and password that we entered on the primary firewall. So that will be route hub and the same password that we used. Okay, and let's go ahead and enable session pickup. Now for the ports, just like the primary firewall, we have the DMZ set as the heartbeat interface based on our design. So let's uncheck it for the WAN interface. And let's enable port monitor for our WAN interface. And finally, let's apply our changes. So right now, the secondary firewall is still working as it is being added and synchronized with the other firewall in the HA cluster. So you will see that this firewall is not responding. Okay, so let's go back to the primary firewall for the HA cluster, and let's view these statistics here. Okay, and when we do that, this will show two firewalls followed by the uptime, the CPU, and the memory usage. It would even show the number of active sessions, total packets, plus viruses and intrusions that were detected on that firewall. So let's go back to the HA monitor page, and we can do that by going to the dashboard. And here very quickly though, so you'll see that the HA status shows active passive this time, which we enabled. So let's go back to configure. Okay, and now this view shows our two firewalls in the HA cluster that we created. And this will show the host name of the firewall, its serial number, its priority, and which one is the master and which one is the secondary or the slave firewall, which is correct based on our configuration. So at this time, the two firewalls officially see each other. So from here, everything should be managed and configured on the master firewall, which is the one that we're currently on. You do not configure anything on the slave. You're not able to do so. So at this time, we have connected the WAN and LAN interface to our secondary firewall, which is shown here with these indicators, connected the same way how we connected it to our primary firewall based on our design diagram for HA. So with the active passive redundancy all ready to go, this means that all traffic is routing through our master firewall and the slave is in standby waiting to take over if, one, the master firewall should encounter a hardware failure, or if the WAN interface on that firewall goes down. So the best and the fastest way to confirm if traffic is routing through the master firewall and not the secondary firewall is to go to HA statistics that we saw before, and you can get to it by clicking on this link here. Okay, and here you will see more active sessions and total packets flowing through the master firewall that are reflected here, okay, along with heavier CPU and memory usage. Now you will see a small number of sessions on the slave firewall, which is normal. And of course, the total packets and bytes were generated when we officially added this firewall into the HA cluster and it started to synchronize with the primary firewall. So let's go back to the HA monitor page. And we do that by clicking up here at this link instead of going to the dashboard page.